Hello class, sorry I wasn't able to be there today, so I put together a video to present to you Developing the Baseball Pitcher, a motor behavior program with planned practice. And so to kick things off, we have to begin with a very simple question. What is a pitcher's job? And so I kind of came out with a list of skills, some physical, some of them mental, some of them are a little bit mixed together depending on the situation of what's happening on a baseball field. But so the first bullet I wrote here, pitching versus throwing. In retrospect, pitching is about throwing a baseball over the plate, trying to force the hitter to take a swing, try to make contact. And in reality, there's a lot of things going on both internally and externally with that pitcher. And so I will get into talking about biomechanics and what it means to be efficient and consistent with mechanics. Thinking versus reacting, which kind of goes hand in hand with physical and mental preparation, is when is it the appropriate time to think? When do you need to be reacting? And how do we teach our athletes to react and to react accordingly to the situation that's at hand? And on top of that, fielding the position. So one of the biggest things that I preach to my 15-year-olds and under is that when you release the ball, you are no longer in control of what's happening unless the ball is hit back at you. And so it's really important to understand that from a mental standpoint, but also from the physical, to be fully prepared to know where to be, know where to throw the baseball if it comes to you, and so forth. And so we'll get into that. And so into this next slide, just want to talk about learning. And real quick, what's important from a development standpoint is understanding how an athlete learns and takes in information. Going through the textbook and the criteria of this assignment, asking the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And what's really important from a coaching standpoint is that not only do we want our kids or young athletes to be processing these questions, but we also have to be coaching with these same questions in mind of them. And so when we talk about guidance for planned practice and to create a transfer of skill, we have to understand, how does this person communicate? How do they respond to verbal and visual instruction? Do they take in information better when we explain to them what they're supposed to feel or what they're supposed to look like? Or are they better off just watching somebody else, whether if it's from video or yourself as the coach doing it, or maybe finding another teammate who performs the skilled movements well the way that you want this specific athlete to learn how to do. So once we establish a baseline for how we want to work with the specific athlete, now we can really start tapping into motor memory and practice memory. And so with that, when it comes to pitching, there are tons of drills that we can go with to create practice and try to get some skill retention out of whatever we're doing. And so some examples of that is to just simply play catch. And the simplicity of that task is what's going to allow an opportunity as a coach to get this player to start thinking about how they're moving, how they're feeling, trying to match tendencies for when they perform a pitch to a certain miss. So let's say you have a pitcher who is right-handed and they're consistently missing everything glove side or to the left of to their intended target at home plate. Something that you can see mechanically is that their head pulls off. And so you can simply give them the cue, hey, keep your eyes onto your target and try to make your body go all the way towards your catcher or towards where he is placing the glove. And so when we see an athlete that can start to pick up on, okay, yeah, when I keep my eyes there, my body stays in line and I'm throwing the ball more consistently in the strike zone. So now I want to get into some of the funner stuff that comes with developing baseball pitchers, and that is talking about biomechanics. And so it's really important to identify the strengths and weaknesses of their movement patterns, as well as assessing their motor behavior and control. And so what we have to understand is, from a baseball perspective, is that there's an infinite amount of ways to throw a baseball, and there's pretty much an infinite amount of ways to be elite. And so when you think about some of the best pitchers in the major leagues, you think about like a Clayton Kershaw or a Chris Sale, a Max Scherzer, they all have very funky, unique movements that are considered abnormal just based off of what a normal pitching delivery looks like. And so while that's very subjective information, we can also take things into a much higher objective state to where we can use a motion analysis software like Dartfish, and we can now start to look at body segments and look at rotational sequence and linear rotation. We can set timing markers to where we can see how much time did it take for them to separate their moment arm, their torso, and their hips, and what did that sequence look like. We can draw some arrows to see if the hips are moving in a certain direction relative to where their torso is, and all of this information can help us understand how to provide the internal and external cues needed to have learned a movement, unlearn it, and relearn it into a new behavior to where they can hopefully just perform at the elite level that they are ultimately searching to be at. And so just to quickly go into some strategies on how we can provide a lot of feedback and great instruction is that technology has become really huge in baseball. And like I mentioned with the motion analysis software, we can have a lot of visual information that we can provide to a young pitcher to where they can see themselves and start to take, just some measurements to where they can see where they actually are. And statistics is huge in baseball. And so there's all these amazing softwares and these different modalities to where we can get information that, can be a huge sensory overload for young pitchers that they don't understand pitching. And so it's really important to understand how to give them this feedback. But we think about like a Rapsodo, which is just a sensor that you can set away from the pitching mound. And as you throw a pitch, it can actually pick up the exact variety of spin axes that it had. What kind of spin rate, what velocity did you throw the pitch at? What was the percentage of that spin efficiency relative to what the average is in high school, college, or professional baseball? It's just amazing statistical information that you can look at to create a better understanding for what do you need to do, what do you need to accomplish. And so we can create a practice plan to where we can focus specifically on, all right, let's get the spin rate higher on this fastball, or let's get it to have a little bit more of a lateral tilt on this curveball. Whatever it is that you're looking for, you can have a very specific goal to have a very specific adaptation. And so when we can have a very good solid progression on a practice plan to where we learned how to play catch, and now we've learned how to play catch when there is a batter right there, we can progress towards more challenging tasks to where we're working on way more specific things. And so some other things that go away from the physical aspect is also the mental preparation. And so with that, I found a quote on page 164 of our textbook, and it says that more transfer occurs when there's similarity of information processing, requirements, or past experiences. And so what that means to me as a baseball coach is that the way that we prepare can yield a lot of confidence to perform certain tasks or certain skilled movements. And so if we know that we did, all the work to make sure that we had a certain movement that made our rotational sequence better on the mound, or we practiced the grip and spinning the baseball to be able to throw that curveball in the game, whatever that is, we also have to understand the various stages that there are with learning. And so in figure 7.6 here, it kind of talks about the cognitive stage, associative stage, and the autonomous stage. And so, like I said in the beginning, we want to start with the basics, learning how to grip a ball, how to have a proper arm action, understanding where your body is in space, having that proprioception. And as we start to figure things out about what we're doing, what we're feeling, now we can start to get into the associative stage, what is the effectiveness of what I'm doing? When am I doing this right? What does it feel like? What is the outcome of the delivery or the pitch that I just threw? Am I more consistent with my fastball and my off speed when I have this certain feeling in my lower half or my upper half, depending on whatever it is that we worked on? And then ultimately get into the autonomous stage to where it's just highly effective. It becomes second nature because we've practiced it so many times. And so while we can do so many things physically, there's also the mental aspect too, where we can take a lot of mental reps practicing certain sensations or, creating some imagery to where we are in a highly stressful situation as a pitcher to where the bases are loaded and there's nobody out and the game is on the line. Having that visualization to see yourself performing those exact movements that make you the best pitcher that you can be. Just really important things. And so when it comes to preparation, I think that it yields confidence. And, just from what we know from a motor behavior standpoint is that if we go through all these stages and we practice them, with a very specific focus, we can really start to develop that motor memory and just make it something that ultimately transfers to performance. And so now getting to one of the most undervalued aspects of being a pitcher is fielding the position. And so something that I always preach to my young baseball players and pitchers is that when you release the baseball, a lot of things are out of your control. And you do become the ninth fielder, and the ball doesn't always have to be hit to you for you to have some kind of role or some situation. And so what's really important from a practice standpoint is to have an understanding of all these pre-planned movements of when you release the ball, what is your next job? And so we, in baseball, typically teach pitchers to make sure that any ball hit to the right side of the infield, so that means towards second base or first base, any ground ball that's hit that way, it should be automatic that you sprint over towards first base just in case you're needed there, meaning that the first baseman, second baseman, they had to go run over and make a play, and they fielded the ball too far away from the bag to where the pitcher needs to cover the bag. So many young pitchers, I see it even in the professional ranks, to where they just forget. They don't react, and, for whatever reason, if it's because they aren't focused enough or they just don't practice it often to where it becomes second nature. It's a really common mistake that we see pitchers make, and so that's something that's really important to implement into practices. With that, there's also having to understand where to be and where to throw. So whenever a batter puts down a bunt and the ball rolls somewhere where the pitcher needs to field it, if it's a sacrifice bunt where there's a runner on base trying to advance to the next base, you have to be very aware of your surroundings and be aware of, who is on the base pass. Is it a fast runner? Is it a slow runner? Where was your infield playing at? Where were they positioned? Who's covering what bag? And so it's really important that from a practice standpoint that becomes something that we establish from the very beginning is where's everyone going to be standing? Who's responsible for covering a certain area of the field? Who's responsible for covering a certain bag and so forth. And so we have all these pre-planned movements to where we practice them in that setting, and it can eventually become really easy because we're doing it in a drill form. And, you see the rest of your pitching teammates go through the drill. And so it becomes very repetitive and pretty easy. And so with that, we have to start to eventually progress towards some kind of variation to where now we start to implement more base runners, and maybe we have an actual batter bunting a ball, and now they can bunt it in different directions at different speeds. And so we can have base runners steal bases. And so there's so many different variations that we can create to something simple like what you're looking at here with these pitchers working on their fielding practice. And we can just create more pressure little by little, depending on where they are. We can create more pressure to where these pitchers have to react. And the more time that they spend having to react in these stressful situations, the more that it just becomes normal to them in a game situation to where now this is for real. This is a competition. We are playing against another team. And so now to wrap things up quickly, just the practice plan that I put together. And so starting everything off with the 6 p.m. time, doing a dynamic warm-up. So going through some kind of arm carry. So that means, going through bands or weighted balls, doing some joint movements and a raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate protocol. And so all we're trying to do is just to create just movement throughout the body and get this athlete to start to move at, the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder, whatever, and just trying to get the athlete moving. And then moving on to the 6:15 time, getting into long toss, plain catch. And so we can have a focus on our throwing rhythm, body sequencing. We can moderate the effort in our throwing, and the way that each individual pitcher is going to go about throwing is just depending on what they like to do. Do they like to, throw as hard as they can from 120 feet, or do they like to stretch their arm out and go work their way towards 200 feet, 250, 300 feet, whatever that may be? Does it help them get their arm looser when they really start to stretch things out and put a big arc on the ball? Whatever that may be, we can have a very individualized program with throwing. And, from the aspect here is we're just labeling everything as just long tossing. So moving on to 6:30, doing some PFPs, pitchers fielding practice. So like I mentioned earlier, we can start things off in a closed loop to where, all the pitchers are lined up on the field, as you see here in some of these spring training videos. Pitchers are getting comebackers, and they have to cover certain bases or throw to a certain base, and so forth. And so it's a very closed loop, controlled environment, and we can open things up. So at 6:45, open things up to an open loop to where now we are focusing on bunt plays and, first and thirds, backing up bases where throws are, coming in from different angles around the field, and we have base runners. We can really start to implement some of that aspect into a practice plan. And so moving on to 7:10, doing some training. And so by training, I mean, specifically working on things that, each individual pitcher needs to improve their performance. So if we found that, Johnny's been having some trouble, getting that triple extension on that back leg, and he's struggling to figure out how to push off the rubber, well, we can use that 20-minute frame there to a set of bands that are attached to his hip and having him resist that into some kind of side lunge, or we can do some plyometrics to where he's doing some single leg hops and having to jump, in a certain direction, whatever that may be. We can create a workout routine to where we are working on certain movement patterns and try to get them to work on those things. One, to just get the repetitions, but then two, to really start to make that mind-body connection of how does this relate to my pitch and delivery, and how does this feel? Like, can I compare or contrast certain feelings that I have? And then now at the 7:30 time to throw a bullpen. Now we can work on specific things, whether if it was your mechanics or, like we mentioned, Johnny's scenario, he's not getting that triple extension on that back leg after doing a series of, a bunch of hops and bounds or whatever we decided to do. Now he can really test it out. And like I said before, we can use subjective information to where we can just, as a pitching coach, look at him, or we can take some video and take a couple light measurements, or get a little bit more objective and use something like a Rapsodo or a radar gun and start to get some metrics and see if the movement patterns that he's going through is it performing at the level that he wants to be pitching at. And then just to top things off, 8 o'clock, doing some conditioning, looking for an aerobic or anaerobic conditioning base. And it all just depends on what point of the week that this pitcher's on. As we wrote here, it's a bullpen day, but how many days are they between their next start or their next appearance or next set of games, whatever that may be. We can have individualized programs for that, for whether we have starters or relief pitchers. But anyways, that is my presentation. And so if you have any questions, I believe Dr. Larson is going to have me Skyping in. And so if you have any questions, I'll be ready for you. Thanks.